Welcome to Part 3 of an overview of travel health. This map shows what's called the meningitis belt in sub-Saharan Africa. And bacterial meningitis is not very common, but during the dry season in this part of Africa, that's generally the first 6 months of the year, there's a fairly high incidence of meningitis, and it's certainly possible to get it, especially if you're going to be in crowds, if you're going to be traveling around, if you're going to be going into marketplaces, things like that. If you're just going for a business meeting, probably not so important, but otherwise it might be a good idea to get meningitis vaccine. It's good for a couple of years. And is very effective at preventing bacterial meningitis. Now, the other place that's high risk, there's also some concern in India. If you're going to be spending significant time in India in crowded places, you might want to get meningitis vaccine. For Muslims making the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj pilgrimage every year, meningitis vaccine is required. It's a large number of people from all over the world crowded into small places, and they have had several significant epidemics of bacterial meningitis. So if you're going to be going on the Hajj pilgrimage, it is important that you get it, and it should be documented in your yellow card. A couple other viruses I'd just like to mention. Hepatitis B, as shown in this map, it has a high prevalence in much of the world. Have to consider HIV as well. Hepatitis B and HIV are viruses that you pretty much have to go out of your way to come into contact with. Hepatitis A you get from eating. I think it's safe to assume that we're all going to be eating when we travel. But hepatitis B and HIV you get from sharing body fluids with people. That would be unsafe sex practices. That would be sharing needles with people. Other types of behaviors. There is a vaccine against hepatitis B, but not against HIV. If you're going to be spending significant time in underdeveloped countries, it'd be a good idea to get the hepatitis B vaccine in case you needed a transfusion someday. Hepatitis B vaccine is now a required vaccine for school attendance in the United States because it's a very safe vaccine, because the disease can be very deadly, even though the prevalence is not so high in the United States. But you have to be smart. I had an 18-year-old come in for a travel consultation one time. He was on his way to Rio de Janeiro, and one of the first things he told me was he was excited because he heard you can get really good tattoos cheap in Rio. I kind of advised him that Rio de Janeiro, Africa, India, a lot of parts of the world really might not be the best place to have people sticking needles through your skin. I'm not sure he paid any attention to me, but it's important to play it safe. And if you are thinking about having sexual activity with locals as you travel, then by all means use safe sex techniques. I wanted to mention altitude illness. Many people who travel above 8,000 feet in altitude develop problems because of the altitude, because of the low oxygen. Most often it's a headache, but sometimes more serious complications like swelling in the brain or fluid building up in the lungs can happen. These generally don't happen below 14,000 feet, and they're less likely to happen if a traveler has acclimated themselves by slowly going to altitude. Cerebral edema and pulmonary edema, or fluid in the lungs, are potentially life-threatening, and a basic treatment is to get the person down to lower elevation as soon as possible. There is medication that can be taken starting a day or two before going to altitude and continuing for another day or two after arriving that can help prevent the headaches and possibly prevent some of the other complications. So it might be worth talking to your travel doctor about that, especially if you know you've had problems with headaches, etc. in the past with altitudes. Travelers going to the Andes, to Cusco to look at the ruins, Machu Picchu, Pisac, some of the other ruins. Those travelers are frequently hit with altitude problems. People going to the Himalayas, climbing Kilimanjaro. These are areas that we frequently see problems. Cusco in Peru, the bottom of the valley is about 11,300 feet elevation, and you arrive there from sea level. There's no time to acclimate. You're there, and it's kind of rough on a lot of travelers. That arrive there in the morning and they're being hustled around to visit the ruins and stuff in the afternoon. A lot of the hotels have oxygen available even for people who are having major problems. The cafes in Cusco and throughout the Andes will sell the tourists coca leaf tea. Coca leaf is well known among the locals for helping prevent the fatigue and problems associated with altitude, but the cafes generally don't tell the tourists that the active ingredient of coca leaf is not water soluble, and making a tea out of it probably is not an effective way of treating altitude-related problems. When I practiced medicine in the Denver area, I treated a young man, a college student, who had come out to ski with his college classmate over Christmas vacation. He had come from sea level in California, and he in fact acclimated in the Denver suburbs at about a 6,400 feet elevation for a few days, and then he and his classmate made several day trips up to ski in Breckenridge, where the base of the slopes is about 8,000 feet elevation. And he was really at no significant risk for high altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, but he came into the office with severe shortness of breath, very low oxygen levels, and coughing up clear watery fluid, and his chest x-ray is shown here, which is very consistent with high-altitude pulmonary edema. All the white areas adjacent to the heart normally would not be there, and this is fluid building up in his lungs. And I had to hospitalize him and treat him aggressively for a couple of days until we could get him on a plane back to California and sea level. And this young man, although he was perfectly healthy and perfectly fit, probably has a high risk of developing high-altitude pulmonary edema anytime he goes to altitude, and he was advised that he needed to be very careful whenever he came back to the mountains. Are there other risks? Oh, of course there are other risks, but most of these are fairly unusual and fairly rare. But if you're going to be doing something fairly exotic, it helps to know what you might face. Rabies is a huge problem in India. But unless you're going to be working with animals in India or on a bicycle trip in India, you're probably not at high risk. But dogs tend to bite bicyclists, and people who are bicycling in India are advised to have rabies vaccine. Schistosomiasis is a parasite that's found in fresh water throughout the tropics, and swimming in lakes and ponds and slow-moving streams may actually be hazardous. It's important to know before you go whether or not this is a risk. Leptospirosis is a bacteria found in streams in the tropics, including Hawaii. Many streams in Hawaii aren't safe to swim in. There's a simple antibiotic that can be used to prevent this from being a problem if you are going to feel a need to swim where there's leptospirosis. Japanese encephalitis. Most people who get this never even notice that they're ill, but occasionally it will cause a full-blown encephalitis with neurological long-term consequences. This is seen in areas where there are, rural areas especially, where there are rice paddies and water buffalo. So if you're going to be spending months or longer in rural Asia in this type of location, you should consider Japanese encephalitis vaccine. There are quite a few other diseases that are spread by biting insects. These usually are not acquired by the casual traveler or even the short-term adventure traveler. But the bottom line is, don't get bit by insects. For any exotic travel, it really is best to consult a travel professional before you go. Now, a lot of people find out what the cost of vaccines are going to be before their trip, and they go into shock. If you're going to be shelling out the money for a trip and you're going to be putting your life potentially on the line, you probably ought to take care of yourself and be prepared. Many of these shots are less expensive if you get them at a public health clinic. The public health clinics can buy the vaccine and administer it far cheaper than I can buy it. Yellow fever vaccine is $120, but it's good for 10 years, so that's not so bad. Rabies pre-exposure vaccine is probably the one that travelers would have the most problem with. 3 shots are needed to give you some protection in case you're exposed to rabies. We're talking $750 for those 3 shots. A few extra points I always like to make. Avoid crime. Don't be a victim, but just as anywhere, be aware of your surroundings, don't do stupid things, get information ahead of time about risks, avoid dangerous areas and dangerous activities. A few years ago there were a couple of tourists that I knew about in Florida that sued their travel agent because they got mugged when they were in San Jose, Costa Rica, and the travel agent didn't advise them that San Jose was a dangerous city. Well, San Jose is no more dangerous than any other city, or any city even in the United States. But these 2 tourists were out bar hopping, and it was, 12:30 in the morning, and they got mugged. Well, I wouldn't advise anybody to be bar hopping at 12:30 in the morning in any city that they're not familiar with and be wandering around. I think you're just looking for trouble. I think they were very fortunate that they only got mugged. So don't do silly things. If you're in a city that you're not familiar with, stay with your hotel, stay with a large crowd, don't go into, dangerous places. Always carry prescription medications in prescription bottles. If you're crossing borders, going through customs, you've got to be able to show what those pills are that you're carrying. Also, take backup copies of your prescriptions and make sure they have the generic name of your medicine on it. Medications have different brand names in different countries, and a doctor may have no idea what the medication is if all you have is the brand name. So have your doctor write backup copies of your prescriptions using the generic name for the medication. Also, carry a photocopy of your passport in a separate location from your passport, because if your passport is lost or stolen, this will make it much easier for you to get a replacement passport at the embassy, which will make it much easier for you to get home. Great travel health resources to consult before you leave when you're doing your initial trip planning is the CDC's website and the State Department's website. These are very simple to remember: cdc.gov/travel, state.gov/travel. The CDC obviously has information on diseases. The State Department has information on crime, the political situation, and a smart traveler enrollment program. Here you see a screenshot of the CDC's website, and you can look up by the disease or by your destination, find out all about vaccinations. It's really an excellent website. They will also often have updates on dengue fever activity in certain areas, and this is important to check out before you go. If there's high dengue fever activity, you may want to apply insect repellent before you get off of the airplane. The State Department website actually allows you to sign up and get updates on your destination, and you can let them know where you're going to be, and this might be a pretty useful tool. Bottom line, when you're planning a trip off the beaten path, is be prepared, take precautions, stay safe, but meet new friends, eat new food, take lots of pictures, and have a fantastic experience. Happy travels.